shimmering silks rustling in marble hallways. The scent of exotic perfumes mingling with sweet Turkish coffee. Whispers behind intricately carved screens. This is the image of the Ottoman harem that has captivated the world for centuries, a gilded cage of beauty, pleasure, and unimaginable luxury. It was the private world of the most powerful man on earth, the Sultan. A world where hundreds of the most beautiful women from across the empire were gathered for his pleasure. But what if I told you that this fantasy, this romanticized vision, is a lie? What if behind the veil of opulence and the promise of power lay a labyrinth of brutal, unwritten, and often lethal laws? A system so rigid and unforgiving that a single misstep, a misplaced word, or even a fleeting glance could lead to a fate worse than death. Tonight, we're not just walking through the golden doors of the harem. We are descending into its shadows. We're uncovering the cruel, calculated, and terrifying bedroom laws that governed every breath a woman took, from the moment she entered as a slave to the day she either ruled the empire or vanished without a trace. This is the story you were never meant to hear. The journey into the imperial harem rarely began with an invitation. It began in chains. The vast majority of women who would one day grace the Sultan's private chambers started their lives as slaves. They were not Turkish. In fact, it was forbidden for Muslim women to become concubines in this manner. Instead, the empire's vast network sourced its human jewels from conquered territories and bustling slave markets. The most prized women were often Circassians from the Caucasus, renowned for their legendary beauty, fair skin, light hair, and striking eyes. Others came from Georgia, Russia, Poland, and even as far as Venice, captured in raids or sold by impoverished families. Upon arrival in Istanbul, these girls, often no older than 7 or 8, were subjected to their first dehumanizing ordeal. They were stripped, inspected by physicians and senior harem women, and meticulously catalogued like prized horses. Every physical attribute was noted, from the quality of their teeth to the arch of their feet. Any perceived imperfection could see them relegated to a lesser role or sold off to a lower-ranking official. If they passed this initial inspection, their old life was systematically erased. Their names were stripped from them, replaced with new Turkish or Persian names that often reflected a physical attribute or a desirable quality like Jil Bahar, spring rose, or Mapiker, moon-faced. Their native language was forbidden, their religion was replaced with Islam, and they were severed from any memory of their family or homeland. This wasn't just a change of scenery, it was the complete destruction of their identity. They were being reforged, melted down and recast into a new mold, a potential vessel for the Ottoman dynasty. Their bodies were no longer their own, they were the property of the Sultan, and their journey into the heart of the empire was a one-way street. There was no going back. From this moment on, their entire existence would be defined by a single goal: surviving, and perhaps one day thriving, within the gilded walls of their new prison. The Western imagination often paints the harem as a den of idle sensuality, a place where women simply waited to be chosen by the Sultan. This couldn't be further from the truth. The imperial harem, especially under the supervision of the formidable Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, was one of the most rigorous and demanding educational institutions in the entire empire. It was an academy, but its curriculum was designed for a very specific purpose: to produce the perfect companion for the ruler of the world. Upon entering, the young girls, now called Kuriai, or novices, began a grueling education. They were taught to speak and write Ottoman Turkish flawlessly. They were drilled in the Quran and the tenets of Islam. But their secular education was just as intensive. They learned music, mastering instruments like the oud and the canon. They were taught to dance with grace and poise, not for seduction in the modern sense, but as a form of courtly entertainment and personal discipline. They studied poetry, learning to recite the classics and even compose their own verses. Calligraphy, embroidery, and a deep, comprehensive understanding of palace etiquette were non-negotiable skills. This wasn't about creating intellectuals, it was about creating women who could entertain, soothe, and converse intelligently with the Sultan, a man who carried the weight of a transcontinental empire on his shoulders. A stupid or clumsy woman was not only unappealing, she was useless. Within this academy, a rigid hierarchy governed every interaction. The novices, Kuriai, were at the bottom, performing menial tasks and serving the senior women. With years of training and discipline, a woman could rise to the rank of Kalfa, apprentice or qualified servant, gaining more responsibilities and privileges. The most accomplished and respected Kalfas became ustas, masters, who would then be responsible for training the next generation. This entire structure was overseen by the Keth Dekad N, the chief female steward of the harem, and ultimately, by the Valide Sultan herself. It was a world run by women, for the benefit of one man. Every skill learned, every poem recited, every note played was a step on a treacherous ladder. The goal? To ascend from the anonymous crowd of novices and become someone worthy of notice. For a woman in the harem, all the years of training, all the discipline, all the quiet suffering, boiled down to a single moment, the possibility of catching the Sultan's eye. This was the ultimate prize, the event that could catapult a nameless slave to a position of unimaginable influence. While there were several ways a woman might be presented to the Sultan, the most famous and perhaps most mythologized is the ceremony of the handkerchief. Picture the scene. The concubines, bathed, perfumed, and dressed in their finest gowns, would be assembled in one of the harem's opulent courtyards or chambers. They would stand in a silent, perfectly still line. The air would be thick with tension, a mixture of hope, fear, and ferocious jealousy. The Sultan, accompanied by his chief eunuchs, would then walk slowly along the line of women. He would observe them, his gaze a source of both terror and ecstasy. The law of the harem was absolute, no woman could speak to him unless spoken to first. No woman could make eye contact unless he initiated it. They were to be beautiful, silent statues, waiting for a sign. If a particular woman caught his fancy, the legend says he would subtly drop a silk handkerchief at her feet. This simple, elegant gesture was a command. It meant she had been chosen. For the woman who received the handkerchief, it was a moment of supreme triumph. She had won the lottery. Her rivals would watch with burning envy as she was immediately whisked away by the harem eunuchs to begin the preparations for her night with the sovereign. However, it's important to note that this was not the only method. More often, the selection was a far more calculated political maneuver. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, played a critical role. She would often carefully select concubines she deemed suitable either for their beauty, their intelligence, or because they came from a faction she wished to promote. She would then present this girl to her son, subtly recommending her for the night. A smart sultan knew to trust his mother's judgment, as her choices were often tied to maintaining stability and balance within the treacherous politics of the harem. Whether by handkerchief or by a mother's decree, being chosen was the first, and most critical, step toward power. The journey from being chosen to entering the Sultan's private chambers was not a simple walk down a hallway. It was a sacred, heavily ritualized procession, every step imbued with centuries of tradition and symbolism. This path was known as the Alt-Nial, or the Golden Road, a long, exclusive corridor within the Topkapi Palace that connected the harem to the Sultan's private apartments. Only the chosen woman, her eunuch escorts, and the Sultan himself were permitted to tread upon it. The preparations were exhaustive. The chosen concubine, now referred to as a Gzd, the one in the eye, would be taken to the palace's luxurious hammam, or Turkish bath. There, she would be bathed, scrubbed, and depilate from head to toe by senior servants. Her hair would be washed and scented with musk and rosewater, her skin anointed with fragrant oils until it shone. She was then dressed in the most magnificent clothes and jewels from the Imperial treasury, a living doll being prepared for the master of the house. As dusk fell, she would begin her silent walk down the Golden Road, flanked by the chief black eunuch and his attendants. The eunuchs were the guardians of the harem, the only men besides the Sultan and his sons allowed within its walls. They ensured the sanctity and security of the procession. The walk itself was meant to be one of quiet contemplation and immense pressure. This was her one chance to impress the Sultan, to secure her future and the future of any child she might bear. Upon reaching the Sultan's private chambers, the final set of rules kicked in. She could not enter his room until he summoned her. Once inside, she had to approach his bed or divan with the utmost humility, often crawling or walking in a way that kept her head bowed. She was required to kiss the hem of his robe or the edge of the carpet beside his bed as a sign of absolute submission. She was forbidden from speaking unless he spoke to her first, and she was expected to fulfill his every desire without question. This was not a romantic tryst, it was a dynastic duty and the ultimate assertion of the Sultan's power. She was there to please him, and in doing so, to serve the empire. The laws of the bedroom didn't end when the sun rose. In fact, the morning after a night with the Sultan was when a new set of rules and a new reality began. The woman's status within the harem was instantly and dramatically transformed. She was no longer just a GSD. If she had pleased the Sultan, she now became one of his iqbals, or favorites. With this new title came a cascade of rewards. She would be granted her own private apartment, known as a dare, a significant step up from the communal dormitories where she had once lived. She was assigned her own servants to attend to her needs. Her daily stipend, or salary, was increased substantially, allowing her to purchase finer clothes, jewelry, and other luxuries. She was now a woman of standing. The other concubines, who may have been her peers or even her superiors just the day before, were now required to show her respect. The ustas who had trained her would now defer to her. However, this newfound status was fragile. It was entirely dependent on the Sultan's continued favor. If he called for her again, her position would be solidified. If he didn't, she could just as easily fade back into obscurity, a painful fall from grace. But there was one event that could cement her power and make it almost unassailable: pregnancy. The moment an iqbal was confirmed to be pregnant, her entire world changed again. She was now a future mother of the dynasty. Her protection and well-being became a matter of state. She received the best food, the constant attention of physicians, and was shielded from the stresses and dangers of harem intrigue. If she successfully gave birth, her status would rise to that of a Qad-en, or official consort. And if that child was a boy, a prince, or a zaid, she hit the ultimate jackpot. She would become a Hasiki Sultan or Ba Qad-en, chief consort, second in power only to the Valide Sultan herself. Her womb had become her weapon, and her child, the key to a level of power that no other woman in the empire could dream of. The bedroom was merely the gate, childbirth was the throne. While the Sultan was the absolute monarch of the empire, within the walls of the harem, another power reigned supreme: the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. She was the undisputed ruler of this female domain, and her authority was absolute. To misunderstand her power was to sign your own death warrant. The Valide Sultan was not just a doting mother, she was the chief administrator, the chief justice, and the chief political strategist of the Imperial harem. Her power was institutional. She controlled the harem's vast budget, managing the stipends and allowances for every single woman, from the lowest Qur'i to the highest-ranking Qad-en. She had the final say on all promotions and punishments. It was she who, along with the chief eunuch, oversaw the education and discipline of the concubines. She was the one who decided which girls were promising enough to be trained as potential companions for her son and which were destined for a life of servitude. Crucially, the Valide Sultan was the ultimate gatekeeper to the Sultan's bed. While the Sultan had the final choice, his mother's influence was immense. She would often select women she trusted, women who were loyal to her faction, and present them to her son. In doing so, she could control the bloodlines, elevate her allies, and ensure that no single concubine grew too powerful without her consent. She acted as a buffer between her son and the sea of ambitious women, filtering out those she deemed a threat. Legendary Valide sultans like Nurbanu Sultan, Safai Sultan, and the formidable Qasim Sultan were among the most powerful figures in Ottoman history. They formed political alliances, corresponded with European monarchs, and effectively ruled the empire as regents for their young sons or through their influence over weak-willed ones. They commanded armies of spies within the harem and the palace, and their network of informants kept them aware of every whisper and every plot. Crossing the Valide Sultan was political and often literal suicide. She could have a girl exiled, imprisoned, or quietly disappeared into the Bosphorus Strait with a single, unspoken command. In the harem, the Sultan might have been the lion, but his mother was the lion tamer. In the claustrophobic, competitive world of the harem, information was power, and gossip was currency. With hundreds of ambitious women vying for the attention of one man, the entire institution was a hotbed of intrigue, jealousy, and plotting. A well-placed rumor could destroy a rival, while a secret uncovered could be used as blackmail. However, this dangerous game was governed by an overarching, unwritten law, the law of silence. On one level, this meant absolute discretion regarding the Sultan. Anything that happened in his private chambers, his moods, his preferences, his secrets, was state business. To speak of it to anyone was an act of treason. The woman who shared the Sultan's bed was expected to be a vault, silent and loyal. A breach of this trust would result in immediate and severe punishment. On another level, the law of silence was a tool of control used by the harem administration. Unsanctioned gossip that threatened the stability and order of the hierarchy was ruthlessly stamped out. Spreading malicious lies about a rival, questioning the authority of a Khalifa or the Valide Sultan, or conspiring with other women could lead to terrifying consequences. The punishments were designed to instill fear and ensure obedience. A minor infraction might result in a flogging or a cut in stipend. More serious offenses could lead to solitary confinement in a dark, windowless room for days or weeks. But for the ultimate crimes, betrayal of the Sultan's trust, conspiracy against the Valide Sultan, or being caught in a forbidden affair, especially with another man, an almost unthinkable crime, the punishment was death. The most infamous method of execution for harem women was chillingly discreet. The condemned woman would be bound, placed in a leather sack, and in the dead of night, taken by boat to the middle of the Bosphorus. There, the sack, sometimes weighted with stones, would be unceremoniously thrown into the cold, dark water. It was a death without a trace, a ghost-like removal from existence. There was no trial, no public record. She simply vanished. This constant threat ensured that while whispers were everywhere, they were traded with the knowledge that the wrong word to the wrong person could be their last. Of all the cruel laws that shaped life in the Ottoman court, none was more brutal or had a more direct impact on the women of the harem than the state-sanctioned law of fratricide. This policy was formally codified by Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror in the 15th century. His decree was chillingly clear: for the welfare of the state, the one of my sons to whom God grants the sultanate may lawfully put his brothers to death. The logic, from the empire's perspective, was cold and practical. In the early days, wars of succession between rival princes had nearly torn the empire apart. This law eliminated that possibility by ensuring only one claimant to the throne remained alive. But for the mothers in the harem, it turned the act of childbirth into a life-or-death struggle. Every Qad-en who bore a son knew that her child's survival depended entirely on him reaching the throne first. Her son's half-brothers, living just rooms away in the same harem, were his future executioners or his victims. The mothers became fierce political rivals, forging alliances, gathering support from eunuchs and viziers, and plotting to ensure their own son's ascension. The harem was not a sisterhood, it was a viper's nest where every mother fought for her child's life. This practice reached its bloody zenith over the centuries. When a new sultan ascended the throne, one of his first acts was often to send the royal executioners deaf mutes, so they could not hear pleas for mercy to eliminate his brothers. The princes were traditionally strangled with a silk bowstring, as spilling royal blood was considered taboo. In the early 17th century, this barbaric practice was replaced by something that was, in some ways, even crueler: the kafes, or the cage. Instead of being executed, the Sultan's brothers and nephews were confined for life in a special suite of opulent but windowless and heavily guarded rooms within the harem. They lived in luxurious imprisonment, surrounded by deaf-mute servants and a few concubines who were past childbearing age. They had every material comfort but no freedom and no contact with the outside world. Many princes went mad from the isolation, paranoia, and sheer boredom. They lived in constant fear that the executioners would one day come for them. The cage eliminated the bloodshed, but it created generations of mentally unstable and inexperienced men who were sometimes called upon to rule the empire after decades of confinement, a decision that contributed heavily to the empire's later decline. For the mothers, their sons were no longer killed, but they were buried alive in a gilded tomb. The history of the harem is written by the victors, the women who became powerful hasikis or formidable Valide sultans. But for every Roxolana or Sem, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of women whose names are lost to time. What happened to the vast majority of concubines who never caught the sultan's eye, who never bore a child, or who simply fell out of favor? Theirs was a life lived in the shadows of the seraglio. They were the cogs in the great machine, essential for its smooth operation but destined never to be its star. For a young Kureyi, the first few years were filled with the hope of being chosen. But as years turned into a decade, and then two, with no summons from the Sultan, that hope would curdle into a quiet resignation. These women were not simply cast out. The harem was a lifelong institution. They continued to serve, but their roles shifted. They became administrators, ladies-in-waiting to the favored consorts, or teachers for the new generation of girls entering the system. They were the cogs in the great machine, essential for its smooth operation but destined never to be its star. For a woman who had been a favorite, an iqbal, but then lost the Sultan's interest, the fall was particularly painful. She would retain some status and a comfortable apartment, but she would have to watch as newer, younger women took her place on the golden road. The jealousy and bitterness in such an environment must have been corrosive. After many years of service, typically after the age of 30 or after serving for at least 9 years, a woman who had never been with the Sultan could be granted a form of honorable discharge. This was considered an act of benevolence. The woman would be granted her freedom and arranged to be married off to a high-ranking official, a pasha, or a military commander. This was a politically useful move for the dynasty, as these women were highly educated, disciplined, and utterly loyal to the Sultan. They could serve as the palace's eyes and ears in the households of powerful men. While this offered a life outside the palace walls, it was hardly true freedom. It was simply a transfer of ownership, a new form of service to the empire that had claimed their youth. For countless women, the gilded cage simply became a larger, but no less binding, one. For the women who were eventually manumitted and married off, or for the consorts of a deceased sultan who were moved to the old palace, the exit from the Topkapi harem was the final chapter in their strange and turbulent lives. This departure, often framed as a reward, was governed by its own set of unwritten but rigidly enforced laws. When a concubine was married to an official, she brought with her the immense prestige of having been part of the imperial harem. Her new husband gained status through his connection to the palace. However, she was forever marked by her past. She was expected to run her new household with the same efficiency and discipline as the harem itself, and above all, to remain unconditionally loyal to the Sultan and the dynasty. She was a political asset, and any sign of betrayal or disloyalty from her or her new husband would be met with severe repercussions. Her freedom came with the implicit understanding that she was, and always would be, a servant of the throne. The fate of a sultan's consorts after his death was different. When a sultan died, his entire harem, including his mother, sisters, and all his consorts and their children, except for the mother of the new sultan, who would become the new Valide sultan, were immediately moved from Topkapi to the Eski Saray, the old palace. This was a form of forced retirement. While they lived in relative comfort, their power, influence, and relevance were gone overnight. They were ghosts of a previous reign, a court in exile, left to live out their days in obscurity. The cruelest law of this final stage was the law of memory. These women, who had lived at the absolute center of power, who had vied for the attention of the world's most powerful man, and who had played the most dangerous political games, were now expected to fade away quietly. Their stories, their struggles, their triumphs, and their heartbreaks were to be locked away with them in the old palace. True freedom, the freedom to control one's own destiny and tell one's own story, was a luxury that almost no woman who entered the Ottoman harem ever truly knew. From the slave market to the grave, their lives were defined by service, sacrifice, and a complex web of cruel and beautiful laws. From the erasure of their identity upon entry to the silent terror of the law of fratricide, the life of a harem woman was a paradox. It was a world of immense luxury built on a foundation of absolute servitude. A place where a single night could lead to a lifetime of power, but where a single whisper could lead to a watery grave. The shimmering silks and gilded walls concealed a brutal reality: the harem was not a fantasy. It was a complex, sophisticated system of control, ambition, and survival, governed by laws as beautiful as they were cruel. So, what do you think was the most terrifying rule of all? Was it the constant threat of being forgotten, the political maneuvering of the Valide Sultan, or the life or death race to put your son on the throne? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. This is a part of history with so much to discuss, and I want to hear what you think. If you found this journey into the secrets of the Ottoman harem fascinating, and if you learned something new, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And for more deep dives into the hidden histories you were never taught in school, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell. Finally, if you know someone who loves history, share this video with them. Thanks for watching. See you next time.